Ask Dan Schneider. Gloria B. writes to me and asks me who I think the greatest American film director is. That's an interesting question. There are, probably maybe a dozen or so film directors you make some arguments for. Um, when I think of the five or six best, I mean, I would have to. It's more or less you have to rule people out. I would rule out Terrence Malick, for example, because he has a small corpus, and while his first film was very good, and the next three films that he did were great, the last couple of films that he's done have gotten mawkish and Old Man Syndrome. So three great films, while interesting, is not really going to put you at the top of the game. John Sayles, who's probably the most well-known independent filmmaker right now, really only has maybe one or two arguably great films, and he hasn't done anything of the highest order in the last 15, 20 years, pretty much this century. So he would be out. When I think of earlier film directors here in America, Frank Capra comes to mind, and he's got maybe three, four, five, six great films. But because his heyday was before usually the world wars, and then really just did It's a Wonderful Life afterwards, it's hard to really consider him as a modern filmmaker. In the same manner, I'd have to dismiss Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd, the silent filmmakers, the studio tours. So that leaves me basically with five possible American film directors as the greatest in American history. And I'll go and sort of dismiss them in terms of last guy out. So at number five, I'd probably put John Cassavetes. And the reason I put Cassavetes at number five is he's got Faces, he's got uh, Opening Night, and he's got The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, which are his three inarguably great films. The other films that he have range from good with some great performances to mediocre stuff that he ended and began his career with, and he didn't do that much because he didn't have the money. At number four, I'd probably put Martin Scorsese, and really it's because for the last 20 or so years he's just been doing these glossy films with no soul, no heart, some good moments here and there, but he's just lost it. His first great film was Mean Streets. Then he did Taxi Driver. He did New York, New York, which wasn't a great film. He came back with um, the film on the boxing film, which slips my mind now, Raging Bull, Jake LaMotta. And then he had a pretty good '80s. He had The King of Comedy. He had After Hours. Some stuff in The Last Temptation of Christ was good. And then he ended up with Goodfellas, his last real masterpiece. So it's been over a quarter of a century since he's done anything really great. In a similar sense, I would have to put the number three guy, Woody Allen, in that same boat. Now, Allen has done more films than Scorsese. He also has done more mediocre films than Scorsese in a sense, although Scorsese hasn't had anything really good, probably for about, well, nothing that could make an argument for greatness for about 20 years. Casino had some moments, so did The Departed, but they were just rip-offs of earlier stuff. Woody Allen has had a couple of great films in the last 25 years, two or three films that you could make some arguments for. However, it's nothing like his golden age, and his 15-year golden age from Annie Hall in '77 to '92's Husband and Wives, I mean, he had about 10 or 12 great films. So even though he has more misses, he also has more hits in terms of great films than Scorsese. And even though he did comedies mostly, he's also done some dramas and done some more existential stuff. So I would have to put Woody Allen just ahead of Scorsese. So that leaves the big two. And the big two, of course, are Stanley Kubrick and Orson Welles. And you could basically make them 1A and 1B because in a sense, these are the two towering giants of American cinema. Both of them were, in a sense, independent filmmakers, although Kubrick had his in at the studio. Kubrick made, some flawless films. His first great film was Paths of Glory. Spartacus and Lolita had moments. Doctor Strangelove, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and um, then A Clockwork Orange. A, a run of three just not only great films, but titanic films that stick in the memory of film history. Barry Lyndon was a bit of a come down. You can make some arguments for greatness for The Shining and Full Metal Jacket. And I think the last inarguably great film he did was his last film with, of all people, Tom Cruise, which was Eyes Wide Shut. But I'd have to give the number one slot to Wells simply because he did more with less. Yes, he did Citizen Kane, which was a great film. It's not one of my favorite films. In a sense, I think it's a bit overrated. I would put it, say, in the top 20 films of all time, but it's a great film. I don't think it's even Wells's best film. The Magnificent Ambersons butchered version that I've seen has some moments. The Stranger has some moments. The Lady from Shanghai has some great moments. His Shakespearean stuff has some great moments. I would count as one of his films The Third Man, which is a great film because I think he had an enormous influence on that film. Mr. Arkadin is, in its restored version, arguably a great film. Then he had the Touch of Evil, which is a great film noir. The Trial, which aside from the last minute or so ending, is a great film. He's got a few films that have never fully made, but his Falstaff film was a great one. F for Fake. With very little money, he did more than anyone else. So if I were to rank the top 5 American, they'd be Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick, Woody Allen, Martin Scorsese, and John Cassavetes in that order. Those are the big 5, and the big 2, arguably 1 and 1, or 1A and 1B, would be Welles and Kubrick. You could make an argument either way. I give Welles the slight edge because he did as much with less. So thank you for the question.